Good morning, everyone, and Boker Tov, Shabbat Shalom. A very auspicious morning because we are beginning to read the Torah for the first portion, and this Parashat Bereshit, named after the first portion of Bereshit in the beginning. So this is quite an important start to the year, to all new things, to hope, renewal, and let's hope we can put the past week behind us, and hope and pray for new things in this new start of the Torah. You'll remember that on Simchat Torah, we read the last portion of the book of Deuteronomy and the first portion of the book of Genesis, but that really wasn't the beginning of the Torah. That was just an exceptional way of the cycle. It's like the pre-start, but now we have the real start. I'm going to go over a few things today, although many people here are regulars. Feels like we should always make sure that everybody's on the level playing field. There are 5 books of the Torah. This is the first one. This one is a little bit of an introduction to what the Torah really wants to tell us about, which is the Exodus from Egypt. So although the book of Genesis, which is of course the Latin name for the book, is and Genesis obviously means origins or source. The book itself is really a prelude to what the Torah really wants to talk about, which is the Exodus from Egypt and the Ten Commandments, or the Commandments. So although we love Genesis and it has all the great family stories in it about the tribe, in many ways it's just a prelude. And after Genesis, we go into the first part of Exodus, which is again part of the kind of the narrative. And then the narrative loses its way and we have no more narrative. We go into Leviticus and the book of Numbers and the book of Deuteronomy, which is really just a recap of Exodus. So when it comes down to it, although we say there are 5 books of the Torah, there really is only one, and that's in kind of the way in which the Jewish mindset works, and that's Exodus. So all the others are just either a prelude or a postlude to that important highlight of the Jewish experience in the ancient times. Question is always is. It comes up and it'll come up time and again. Is it real? Did it happen? What do we think about that? I'm going to leave that unanswered for the moment. All of those are great questions. And the most important thing about the whole thing is to ask the questions, because we keep reading it every time and over again. So hopefully this year you have even better questions than last. That's the point. That's the point. You don't change the text, you change the questions. So that's what we want to do. Where's Leslie? There you are, Leslie. Great. Welcome, because I know you'll have really good questions, and looking for really good questions from you this year. Now, let us start with the blessing for reading and studying and asking questions about the Torah. The last words, Allah Asok B'divrei Torah, Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Asher Kitshanu B'mitzvotav B'tzivanu Asok B'divrei Torah. We thank God for giving us this opportunity to la'asok, to engage with, to struggle with divrei Torah, words of Torah. We also should say the Shechianu, because it's the first time we're reading this portion this year. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Shechianu V'kivanu Higianu L'zman hazeh. We thank God for really giving us this opportunity to reach this moment, reach this season. Not everyone has been privileged to have another year of Torah study, and we are so grateful for that. Now, Bereshit, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. Let's get it up on the screen. If you have a Chumash or a Torah or a Bible, we love to have different translations and to compare ways in which the Torah is written about and discussed. So it's perhaps always the first question. I know these are old questions, but like when and where was it written? What do we know about it? We have no existing original material. We cannot tell you when exactly it was written. We do know when it was collected and brought into public readings. So we know that was in Babylonia in around the 5th century before the Common Era. So we know that was the time when the Jews started to read what we at that point are calling the Torah. So that's obviously a mark in time that we know is part of the story of the readings of the Torah. And we also know that's the time when they're living in Babylonia, so that Babylonia and Babylonian culture and Babylonian religion is influencing the readings and the text itself. Perhaps it had been collected orally as stories for generations and then was finally written down. But the fact that we're actually reading it in the autumn means that we're already in the Babylonian calendar, because the Babylonian calendar started in the autumn. That was the beginning of the new year, as opposed to the Israelite calendar, which begins in the spring with Pesach. So it's already kind of an indication that this is a text that comes out of a Babylonian context. And we don't know anything else about the prehistory, but we do know there are other similar Near Eastern stories about creation that are similar. And the most similar is the one called Gilgamesh. If you want to read the Gilgamesh epic, it's an interesting story. It's very similar to our story, except the hero, instead of being a human being like Adam, who makes a mistake and has to be expelled from the Garden of Eden, the hero in the Gilgamesh story kind of is a semi-god and is treated differently at the end of the story. So it's almost like the Israelites who adapted or learned that story or copied that story or indeed created that story. They gave their spin to it, which becomes a story of moral responsibility. And that, I suppose, in many ways sums up the whole Torah. The Torah is not just a group of stories for the love of either the characters or the love of the God who helps those characters. It's a story of human responsibility. It's a story of partnership with a divine partner that allows the Israelites to feel that they're on a special journey. They have a special mission. They are a special people in a special land. So all of those themes are going to emerge out of the book of Genesis. Originally in Hebrew, of course, that's why we're looking at the Hebrew and the translations. The first translation that we know of was in Greek. We think that's a very important translation because it may preserve ways of reading the story that were lost when the Hebrew kind of went out of fashion. So the Greek version, the Septuagint, is considered as authoritative as the Hebrew version, and sometimes even more so. The Hebrew may have been corrupted later on. So we have a Greek translation, and then we have a Latin translation called the Vulgate, which is, of course, the classical Catholic translation of the Hebrew Bible. And then, of course, as we all know, famously in the 17th century, we get the English translation commissioned around the time of King Henry VIII, kept secret. Nobody should really understand the Bible. That was not the point in medieval England. It was a way of actually, it was a heresy to translate the Bible into English. People were burned at the stake for that. So the fact that we have eventually what's called the King James Version, King James Bible, not the first English translation, but one of the first by the time King James comes to the throne, and we all know who that is now, having spent some time in England. He commissions this version, and that becomes the authoritative, definitive English version of the Old Testament. But made a lot of errors, and has been translated and retranslated many times since then, both into English and then into that other strange language, American. So we have lots of translations, and that we benefit from many of them. I'm using a online version of the Hebrew Bible called Sepharia, Sepharia. It's up here on the top left, Sepharia. It's an open source free material. I'm going to show you, if anyone doesn't remember from last year how to use it. It can be an interesting tool, and there's lots to learn. Last thing to say before we begin is that in the Jewish way of reading the Torah, we divide it into sections. These sections are not the same chapters and verses that are known in the translations. So the Hebrew version is not divided into chapters and verses. It's really one running story from beginning to end. Although if you look at the Torah, as we did on Simchat Torah, there are gaps between the books. But apart from that, there are no real gaps between the verses. It's just one long running story. So the people who decided that we should read it publicly in the synagogue also decided that we should break it up into sections. So they broke it up into 52 sections, one section per week for the whole year. And then we call that a parasha, or a portion. And that parasha then has a name. It's usually named after the very first distinctive Hebrew word. So this parasha is the first word, which is Bereshit, and we call this parashat Bereshit. And every portion then has its own distinctive life because it's divided. And sometimes the divisions are arbitrary. It's not. Sometimes stories are cut in half because we're not reading according to a story. We're reading according to this way of dividing up the Torah. Not all of the portions are equal length. Some are longer, some are shorter. It's not entirely clear why they divided them up the way they did. For Bereshit, what we're going to have is the story of the creation. We're then going to have a second story of creation that's written slightly differently. We will ask the question, why are there two? Then we're going to have a story about giants in the land, and a lineage of everyone from Adam, 10 generations, down to the generation of the people who were evil, who did bad things. And we're going to find out next week, in the next week's portion, that there was one man in that generation called Noah, who was good, righteous, and therefore God decided to start again with him. So if you like, each story in the first books of Genesis are really what we might call origin stories or beginning stories. So this week it's the beginning of creation, and Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve. In the next week, it's the beginning of the kind of the story of the human family with Noah and his wife and his family. And then the third week is the book of begins with the book of Abraham, the story of Abraham and the special tribe and special family that God chooses. So if you like, these first 3 weeks are all about beginnings. First of all, the beginning of creation, then the beginning kind of the universal story, and then the beginning of the Israelite story with Abraham. So they're all basically the same story, but they're just written about different parts of humanity. One might think, well, that's clear. Why even question that? And yet the rabbis do, and they say, why do we start with creation? Why don't we start with Abraham? Surely we're interested in just our people's story, but no, we're interested in the universal story, and we're interested in the story of the creation of the cosmos. All of that is part of our story too. So, unless there are any questions about any of the introduction, we shall go to the reading. And BK,
Rabbi, there was a question
yes.
In the chat about when was the Septuagint?
Oh, so the Greek translation of the Bible dated around the time of before the Common Era, about 200. Obviously, at Hellenistic times in the land of Judea, the times when the Maccabees were around, and the Greek influence was important. There were Jews living all over the Middle East, including Alexandria in Egypt, and that's probably where the Septuagint was created, in Egypt. We think, there's a myth that Jews only lived in the land of Israel and then were dispersed around the world. That's not true. The Jews definitely from the time of the 5th century, when they returned to the land of Israel from Babylonia. Obviously, they were still Jews living in Babylonia. There were Jews now living in Judea, but they were spreading themselves out into Egypt, Turkey, Syria. So we do have Jewish communities all over the region until the Romans come, when then, of course, because of forced migration, the Jews now come into Western Europe, though they may have been in Western Europe before that as well, travelers. We don't have records necessarily of settlements, but we do have records of Jewish travelers going all the way to Cornwall in England from the time of the Romans. And there might have been Jewish Roman traders in England. We heard a little bit about that when we were in England last week. So it's a fascinating story.
Thank you.
Yeah, you mentioned, thank you. You mentioned that the Genesis, or the Torah was first in Hebrew before it was translated. So we started reading it sort of in this form the 5th century before the Common Era. So was biblical Hebrew what people spoke, what Jewish people spoke, or who spoke Hebrew?
Obviously, we have no tape recordings, but we're going to assume, I think, that biblical Hebrew was spoken, that it was their language, and they may have used multiple languages. There is something called Proto-Hebrew, which is a different alphabet, but sounds like Hebrew. So I think we'd have to ask linguists about that. You will know that little later on, as we move into the Greek and the Roman period, around the time of Jesus, we suddenly find a new language called Aramaic. Now, Aramaic is a combination of Hebrew and some Arabic and some Greek. So it's a bit of a joined up language. It's a bit like Yiddish is, where Yiddish is Hebrew and German. So Aramaic is this mixed up language that seems to have become the common language of the people, and Hebrew then gets relegated to the sacred books. So it seems that although Hebrew might have been the language that Abraham spoke, by the time we get to people like the Maccabees, they were really speaking more Greek and Aramaic. Certainly by the time of Jesus in the New Testament, we're getting Aramaic and Greek as the common languages. And Hebrew then becomes like a religious language, a sacred language. And it's not until 1900 that Hebrew comes back as a proper language that's alive and used by people, and is resuscitated by a very famous 19th century linguist called Eliezer ben Yehuda. And he's the one who decides we're Jews, we're coming back to the land, we should use our own language.
Thank you.
And he was quite a dictator. So he said to his family, everybody in this family has to speak Hebrew. And they all spoke German and Yiddish and Spanish and whatever. This is in Palestine in the early 20th century. And the family, said, no way, we don't know that language. It's terrible. And he said, no one lives in this house who doesn't speak Hebrew, and anyone who came into the house had to speak Hebrew. And that's the way he got the Hebrew language started again. Okay. I was going to say, BK, since you're had a wonderful beginning of leading us last night, would you like to start us off in the Torah?
When God began to create heaven and earth, the earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep, and a wind from God sweeping over the water, God said, Vayehi or, let there be light. And there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day and called the darkness night. And there was evening and there was morning, a first day.
Okay, great. So what do we notice about this first day? What can we talk about? What either its content or its origin, its source?
Well, of course, it's not what we grew up on. We grew up on when God created, as opposed to when God began to create.
Right. So that's the very first difference here, and the Jewish readings of this word Bereshit have always been slightly different from the translations, particularly the English translation. In the beginning, God created, because Bereshit is actually an active participle. It means in the creating of, and it seems to indicate that this is not a story about the science of how God created the world. This is not intended to be a scientific explanation of how the world was created, and never was meant to be. It's rather a story about what's happening in the partnership between God and the creation. It's a relational story. It's a story about this partnership. And eventually it leads to what's called the covenant, the Brit, that God will make with particular groups. The Israelites are one group. The covenant with the universal, that's the rainbow. There's a covenant that results in Shabbat, which is also considered a sign of the covenant. There's other kinds of covenants throughout the Bible. So this is really just the beginnings of demonstrating to us that God is opening up a relationship with us, and it's part of a much larger picture. Therefore, it's not as if there wasn't something beforehand. And in fact, we get a description of what comes beforehand when we have what's called tohu vavohu. And here it's translated as unformed and void. Now, tohu vavohu, as you can hear from the words, doesn't mean anything. It just means kind of gobbledygook, tohu vavohu. They're just two words. They don't actually mean anything. So the earth was kind of blah, 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 and then through this act of creation, or this beginning of a relationship, God gives light, or God speaks light, more literally, because God says, Yehi or, let there be light. Now, if you want to, and we're all scientists here, we're all products of the modern world, you can think of this a little bit scientifically and say, well, wait a minute, it's true. There is some truth to the fact that the universe was a mess of floating rock. And it wasn't until the forces of gravity began to coalesce planets and solar systems and galaxies. So there is this notion of something that starts very ambiguous, very vague, and brings itself together into a mass, a form, which creates matter. And that matter is particularly, in solar systems, that matter is organically, what's the word, initiated by light, particularly in our solar system. So light is the initiator of the origins of life. Without light, without the sun, we wouldn't be able to have life. So, it depends where you are. You can think of this as a myth. You can think of and a wonderful story. You can think of this as literature, and how we're just trying to, give poetry to something we're seeing in the natural world. We can think of this as early science because, although this isn't science, all the things that are created as far as we understand in the evolutionary cycle in the right order. It's not as if they made this up. We have light first, and light is the first thing that, as far as we know, in the universe was needed to be created to create anything else. So very much different ways of thinking about how this passage becomes important to us. Oh, we've got lots of hands up. Let's go to Lucy.
This might be a question that a child might ask, and it's very unscientific, more theological. But when I read the first sentence, and I've read this in Hebrew many years and even have sung that first line, today I'm looking at when God began to create. So I'm wondering, where did God come from?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Not a question the Torah seeks to answer. Assumption that the God is. So we're not going to find that answer here. That we'll have to do a theological Jewish studies course to think about that. Mm-hmm. And as a little bit of an advertisement, on Wednesday night, if you come along to our Jewish Christian course that we're offering as part of the Hebrew College Open Circle program, we're going to be doing the history of God on our first session. So that's maybe where we'll have a good go at that one. Leslie.
In a way, Lucy asked the same question. In a way, everybody has. But I just remember in my very sketchy religious training, people kept saying, if God created everything, who created God? And what is the answer to that? There is no answer, right?
Not today.
Okay.
BK.
So two things that I'm realizing for the very first time, which I think is fascinating, is that we all make the assumption that Genesis is saying that God began to create the universe. What I'm reading here in the New International Version, and pretty much every version I think we're going to read, is that it says God created the heavens and the earth. So there's no real guarantee that there wasn't something created before the earth. So that's number one, that is a new information for me. And number two is there was evening and there was morning, not there was morning and evening, the beginning and the ending of the day. So I find that really interesting as well.
Yeah. And that's, of course, why the Jewish day starts in the evening, and why we have Erev Shabbat and Erev Yom Kippur and all of those things, because the evening is the first part of the new cycle, and the day ends in the evening as the dusk goes down. That's why Orthodox people are particular about the time of when Shabbat begins and ends, because of this verse.
Well, if we began in darkness and went to light, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Awesome. That's right. So the speaking into the light is the dawn and the new day that has come after the darkness of the night. I want to just point out some Hebrew words that are really important because they're going to be repeated. This is a poem. All the things I said before about how to read this are all ways to do it. So part of it, this is poetry, of course. So first of all, the word Bereshit has a first letter, the B, and the B is a preposition. It can mean as things are starting, or in in the start of things, but it's not necessarily part of the word. So Reshit is the word, and you'll recognize that word because of the word Rosh and Rosh Hashanah and the beginning of the new year. And so Rosh, which literally means head, so it's the head, it's the start of something. So Bereshit, as things are starting up, bara Elohim. So the verb always comes before the subject. So in Hebrew, the subject is the end of the line. So bara means to create. Now, there are many words for creation in Genesis, but bara is the only one reserved for God. So anything that God does is called bara. And then Elohim is also an important word to look at, because there are, again, different names of God. This is the one where Elohim is used. El is probably the oldest form that we know of a word that describes God, and is used in other Semitic languages. El, like Bethel, is a place. All our names, Michael, Gabriel, Uriel, who's here has got an L on the end of the name, Gail.
Right.
They're all L.
Even Emmanuel. Yeah.
Emmanuel, thank you. These are all very ancient uses of the name God. And Elohim, we might think is that it's a plural because it has im in it, like we just talked about, the plural. So kalavim is dogs. But im here doesn't seem to suggest a plural, but rather what's called an intensive. So El is maybe kind of a God, whereas Elohim is the God. So it's the one God. So that's where the word Elohim seems to indicate that we have that as part of the name that's used here. Now, we know there are other names for God, and some scholars believe that the way the name of God is used indicates who wrote it. So we would call this an E version of the Torah, meaning that we believe the group of people who wrote this version of the Torah were part of the E school because they used the word Elohim. Whereas later on, we're going to have the word Adonai, the 4 tetragrammaton, Yod, He, Vav, He, which is considered the J school from Jehovah. So the J school we'll be looking at later. Anyway, so as B said, as the world was beginning, as the heavens and earth were beginning to form, God was part of that relationship. And as I said, the world was tohu vavohu, whatever that means. There was something before, and there was this darkness. Obviously, the first evening, there was darkness. And then whatever happened, Ruach Elohim, the Spirit of God or the wind of God, Murachefet. Murachefet means really to sweep, to cast itself over the face of the Mayim. So we already have water. So water's already there, even though we're starting things. And then God said, Yehi Or. So the first act, the first speaking into material mass is light. And now we have a combination of light and water. And I think I told some people recently that there's a new BBC program about the formation of the Earth, which I was watching over the summer, which is not yet available except through BBC, and you can't get that in this country yet. I'm sure it'll come out in later times, but the program really emphasized the fact that the creation of the atmosphere that allows us to breathe and to be here on Earth and to let life happen comes from the fact that there's water and there's sun. And once you've got those two elements, then everything else is inside those two elements that allows everything else to happen. And through miracles of science, which are beyond my knowledge, the atmosphere begins to create, where that creates that shield where it allows then life to begin under the water to actually originate. And we're talking about, of course, hundreds of millions of years ago. So we've seen now we're going to get this repetition each time. Vayar Elohim et haor ki tov, and God saw the light ki tov. What does that mean? That it was good. Tov can be a description. We see something, we like it, we call it tov. It could also mean goodness. There's something good has come about, that it has a moral dimension, which again relates to the nature of the story. Is not just a narrative, a description or an explanation, but rather a moral story. Light is good, that there is goodness in this life that's about to be created. And then the most important word, I think, in this whole story is the word v'ya'avdel. It's here at the end of the line. It's the word to divide. And we have it in the word havdalah, and it's the word that suggests that what God is doing here is creating categories, and they're being divided. So here we're having a division between or and choshech, between light and darkness. So these categories, these divisions, are the ways in which the world is going to be defined. It's going to be defined by categories. Later on, we're going to have other divisions. In fact, each of the days is actually a division. And that, again, scientifically is not unfamiliar to scientists, because the idea of beginning to separate out amorphous masses into minerals and elements and molecules, and then later on into atoms, these become ways in which we begin to think of the way in which life operates. It's a division of categories. Matter is separate from that which is not matter. Life is separate from death. Humans are separated from other forms of life. So that separation allows us to become who we are. And then at the end of every day, we're going to get this, vayikra. And remember, these are all words that God is speaking. And the idea of God speaking this life into being is obviously a hugely metaphysical idea. Vayikra Elohim la'or yom v'lachoshech kara laila. So God speaks day and speaks night. And then we get this famous phrase that comes at the end of every day. There's going to be an evening, there's going to be a morning, and they name each day. Obviously, a day, what does a day mean? What is a yom? Is it a 24-hour day, or in fact, is it a millennium, or is it a cycle of this act of creating? Let's move on to day 2. Let's have Lucy, would you read day 2?
Sure. If I can ask one question first.
You certainly can.
Yikra, when I think of the word kara, I think of shout. Is that correct? Or is that more
loud voice? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So vayikra. So do we imagine God really speaking loudly about this?
I think the emphasis here is, as actually the English gives us, it's calling out. It's proclaiming.
Okay.
Proclaiming, perhaps that's the word. Giving notice to these things, giving us notice to these things. And if you think about this being read or being recited in ancient times, it's almost like whoever's reciting this is saying, people, God proclaims that we are in a cycle, that we are in day, there is a day and there is a night, and there is a separation between them. And I'm proclaiming that, that's the way of the world, the way of life. Yeah.
It's definitely a poet. It's definitely poetry.
Yes.
God saw that the light was good. Where am I starting there?
Let's do expanse. Yeah.
Okay, there we are. God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the water, that it may separate water from water. God made the expanse, and it separated the water which was below, and the expanse from the water which was above the expanse. And it was so. God called the expanse sky, and there was evening and there was morning, a second day.
Great. So we've got some questions about the first day first. So let's do that, and then we'll go to the second day. So Dick, there you are.
I just thought there's some, back to the idea of Elohim, I thought there's some irony in saying that, God, though singular, is also plural, right? And, we're now however many eons, biblically or otherwise later, and we're back from saying that everybody has to be either a he or a she. They can now be a they. And so there's a certain, goes around, comes around.
Yeah. We got so stuck up in our polarities, in our binary world.
Right.
We forgot there could be another type of world. Yeah, I like that. Leslie.
I'm reading this, and I mean, who was there to say this is what happened? What is the authority to say that anything like this happened? What visionary or what shyster or what said this is exactly what happened, and why do we believe it?
It's a great question, obviously. I can't answer that question, but I will say that the rabbis asked the same question, in the sense that they said, wait a minute, why are we starting with this stuff? And let me tell you what Rashi says. So I'm going to move you away from my screen for a second. This is what you can do in Safari. I showed this to some people last year. So if you click on the verse, I assume you're seeing me through this, and then you go over to the right-hand table that's just appeared, go to commentary, and then go to Rashi, who is the famous medieval commentator, and look at what Rashi says. Can everybody see this? Yes. Okay, so Rashi says, the Torah, which is the law book of Israel, should have commenced with the verse from Exodus 12, this month shall be unto you the first of the months, which is the first commandment given to Israel. So Rashi is saying, this stuff is completely rubbish. What we should have started with was, because this is a law book, so we should have started with the first commandment. The first commandment, according to Rashi, which I'm not sure is correct, is the laws of Rosh Chodesh, the laws of the first month, which appear in Exodus 12. So then Rashi says, well, what's the reason then that it commences with the account of the creation? And he says, because of a text in the Psalms, which is kind of strange, using a text from another book to decide what should be in the Torah, he declared to his people the strength of his words, i.e., he gave an account of the word of creation in order that he might give them the heritage of the nations. For should the peoples of the world say to Israel, you are robbers because you took by force the lands of the 7 nations of Canaan, Israel may reply to them, all the earth belongs to the Holy One, blessed be he. God created it and gave it to whoever he pleased. When he willed it, he gave it to them, and when he willed it, he took it from them and gave it to us. So it becomes a bit of a political statement on Rashi's behalf that the reason why we start with the Torah is because we're trying to demonstrate that we own the land of Israel. So it becomes kind of a political statement. So, Leslie, I can't answer your question, but I can tell you that Rashi also wonders why we're starting with weird story and not with a story that makes much more sense, that this is a law book, so shouldn't we start with the first law, which is the law of Rosh Chodesh? But,
at least I'm in good company.
Yeah, you're in good company. So I see BK's hand up too, yeah.
Gail was before me.
Oh, Gail.
Yeah, hi. I have heard people who know about physics and the origin of the universe point out that the Big Bang theory posits what was it originally? It was photons, which is light.
Great. I don't know enough. I have been told that the Big Bang theory is not the way scientists explain it anymore. so there was no such thing as a Big Bang, as I understand it, but rather there was an unfolding or an expansiveness that comes from a single point, and that single point was probably a point of light. So
well, whatever you call it, it's like I agree. It's out there, but it's, people forever will be debated.
The more we learn about the origins of the universe, the more I think that we will find that miraculously and somewhat strangely, and without trying to give it any scientific justification, that this story, the myth of this story, becomes quite significant, which of course is why some people will dismiss it very quickly, because it's, how can you create a world in 6 days, as if that's what it's about. But we wonder what it really is saying. BK, back to you.
So first of all, you remember that Pam Wernst says to us many times that just because something didn't happen doesn't mean it's not true. So that's first of all. Second of all, every religion on the planet has a creation myth. So we needed one too. And thirdly, the beginning of the Greek duality thought process of good and bad really begins with light and darkness. And so I think it's important for me to remember that when we read this, that darkness is not the bad and light the good, which is easy to make out here. There was darkness and then it became good with light. We have to be careful of the sort of a overlay of Greek duality in here.
Right. Good point. And also, of course, in contemporary terms, black as evil and white as good is a very disturbing metaphor that we've adopted very easily and not thought about it until in more recent times. So
feminist theology.
It's not saying that here either, because the choshech is important. It's needed. We're not saying,
Feminist theologians have reformed this in some way to point out that the womb is darkness.
Yes.
So I'll hush now.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, some wonderful connections that we can make. So just to go into the second day then. So first of all, this idea of two forms of water in the upper atmosphere and water underneath the earth. Well, okay. I think, we can understand that. And that here again, the word lahavdil, mavdil here that was used here, to separate. And that again is, as I understand it, is the separation was part of the creation of life, that the waters that had boiled, the atmosphere had been created by this intense heat that had come from the cooling of the rock, and that created water condensation in the atmosphere that then drops back down to earth when the rocks cool over thousands of years, millions of years, and that water then those molecules become water that exist on the earth and on the planet, and that water spreads across the planet, so the planet is mostly water, and all of that is found within the very elements that come from that original source. So it all comes from a point of origin, and is evolving and unfolding as the eons go by. So that idea that this rakia, what in some translations is firmament, but here is translated as expanse, creates that distinction between where the waters are held above the atmosphere and where they are held below the ground. We come back to that when we have the story of Noah, because when the flood comes, we're told that the waters come from above and below. So the flooding is the breaking down of that separation, which is why it's so disastrous for humanity. And I'm sure you all know that there were many what are called mass extinction events in the life of the earth, including mass extinction events where water basically overwhelmed everything else. And now there wasn't human life at that time, but we know that water has both an opportunity to provide life, but it also can overcome everything else, as we see today in the fact that the water is either the warming of the waters or the storming of the waters is now quite a danger to other forms of life. So we have that division, and then we have the evening and the morning, the second day. Let's go to the third day. Rob, you're there with us. Could you read the third day for us?
Yes. So God said, let the water below the sky be gathered into one area, that the dry land may appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and called the gathering of waters seas. And God saw that this was good. And God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, seed-bearing plants, fruit, trees of every kind on earth that bear fruit with seed in it. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, seed-bearing plants of every kind, and trees of every kind bearing fruit with the seed in it. And God saw that this was good. And there was evening and there was morning, and I can't see the next line, but I assume it means it was the third day.
Yay, well done. So we're now getting a separation of the dry land, and on the dry land we get vegetation. Again, this is in the order that, as we understand it, of evolution. There's light, water, and then we get dry land, and on the dry land we eventually get seed-bearing plants. And again, as far as we understand it, there have been different types of vegetation on the earth that have been there and then went away, and different types of vegetation came back. So as I understand it, the earliest form of vegetation were things like ferns, bromeliads, those kind of things. And then we have vestiges of that today, but then later on, when mammals appeared, we got fruit-bearing trees so that mammals could eat from them, which was different from the vegetation that was originally formed. But all of that comes in one day, according to this narrative. So that was the third day. And again, the word lahavdil is here to separate, because we're separating between the yavashah, the dry land, and the mikveh, the gathering of the waters, the mayim, the seas. And it's good, kitov. Okay, let's go to number 4. Who would like to read number 4? Who likes to talk about the moon and the stars? Jill.
God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate day from night. They shall serve as signs for the set times, the days and the years, and they shall serve as lights in the expanse of the sky to shine upon the earth. And it was so. God made 2 great lights, the greater light to dominate the day and the lesser light to dominate the night and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the sky to shine upon the earth, to dominate the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that that was good. And there was evening and there was morning, a 4th day.
Just to point out that and Peter, you can comment on this, perhaps, the fact that each day is considered, is described as I think the right word is an ordinal, meaning it doesn't actually say the 4th day. It says the day of number 4, Yom Revi'i. Is that right? Correct, Peter?
I don't know. They look more like ordinals to me. Arba'ah would be the cardinal.
That's right. So that's what I said. They're ordinals. Yeah, they're not
ordinals. Yeah.
Yeah, they're ordinals.
That's what 4th is, as opposed to the number 4.
So it doesn't actually say first day, second day, third day, 4th day. It actually says Yom Echad, day 1, Yom Sheni, day 2, Yom Revi'i, day 4. So
Ahad is in a class by itself. That really is day 1.
Right. Yeah.
After that, they seem to me to be literally second day, third day, fourth day. How else would you say second day, third day, fourth day?
Wouldn't you say Yom Shenit or for second day?
Shanit would be feminine. The genders get mixed up with numbers, so it's hard to be sure, but I'm pretty certain Shanit is the feminine, Shanit masculine. Now I can't even remember the order, the cardinal number.
We'll have to go back on that. So
yeah,
we get to the fourth day, and we have these lights in the sky. Now you might think, well, we had light, so why do we need other kinds of light? And what is remarkable here is that there's a suggestion that there's more than the sun. The sun and the moon are part of our atmosphere, our solar system, but there's an acknowledgement here there's something else beyond the sun. There is another kind of light, kind, as someone said, photons or whatever it is.
Yeah.
There's something beyond the notion that the sun is the, if you look up in the sky, you might think in ancient times, oh, well, look, the sun, it's amazing, let's worship the sun, as the Egyptians. But here the Israelites are saying, wait a minute, there's two sorts of light. There's kind of God's original light that forms the earth and the universe, and then there's this light of our own, which is the lights in the sky, the sun and the moon. They do think of the moon as a form of light, which, as we know, the moon doesn't have any light. It's just a reflection of the sun. And they call it the greater light and the lesser light. So that's the sun and the moon. And they, again, it's not there because it's been created. It's there to serve a purpose. And what's the purpose? It's to shine upon the earth and to separate, to dominate the night and the day. In other words, to tell us when it's night and to tell us when it's day. In other words, the sun and the moon are there to tell time. They give us the way of telling time. They tell us where we are in time. And that's the purpose, if you like, of the fourth day, to give us a sense of how we count time. And this is good, Kitov. And then there was evening and morning of fourth day. I just want to get to the seventh day. So let's go on to the fifth day. Gail, would you like to read the fifth day?
Okay. God said, let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures and birds that fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky. God created the great sea monsters and all the living creatures of every kind that creep, which the waters brought forth in swarms, and all the winged birds of every kind. And God saw that this was good. God blessed them, saying, be fertile and increase, fill the waters in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth. And there was evening, and there was morning, a fifth day.
So this fifth day separates creatures that are flying, all kinds of creatures, not just birds, but all kinds of creatures, including insects and everything else that's flying in the sky. And then everything is in the deep of the waters. Here, the translation is sea monsters. I'm not sure that's what I like. Taninim, Gedolim. So it seems to be like great creatures. And then there are those that creep on the earth. So we have creatures above the earth, creatures under the waters, and creatures that creep. So that would be like crabs and scorpions and all of those kind of animals that live in two worlds. And what's interesting about that later on is that the rabbis decide that, or in fact, Leviticus decides that anything that seems to go over two categories, so like creatures that live in the water but creep on land, shouldn't eat those. Those are not good things to eat, because what it does is it's breaking that lahavdil, it's breaking the separation. Where you've got one thing in one category and one thing in another category, that's great. You want to keep those categories separate. Where you've got something that's crossing the boundary of those categories, not kosher, not good. Certainly you don't want to eat it. and there'll be other ways that you don't want to do things with that cross boundaries. So this is becoming a lesson in how to keep what we think of as the world's order in its place. Everything has its place, everything has its category, and it keeps that world in order. And let's just go to the 6th day. That's number 5. Number 6. Linda, hello. Would you like to read number 6 for us?
Hello, yes. God said, let the earth bring forth every kind of living creature, cattle, creeping things, and wild beasts of every kind. And it was so. God made wild beasts of every kind and cattle of every kind and all kinds of creeping things on the earth. And God saw that this was good. And God said, let us make humankind in our image, after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that creep on earth. And God created humankind in divine image, creating it in the image of God, creating them male and female. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fertile and increase, fill the earth and master it, and rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the living things that creep on earth. God said, see, I give you every seed-bearing plant that is upon all the earth, every tree that has seed-bearing fruit. They shall be yours for food. And to all the animals on land, to all the birds of the sky, and to everything that creeps on earth, in which there is the breath of life, I give all the green plants for food. And it was so. And God saw all that had been made, and found it very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the 6th day.
So you'll notice here that it doesn't say Vayihi Tov, that it was good, but Vayihi Tov Mod, it was very good. So this is considered the crown of creation, the ultimate of creation. So just to summarize before we get into questions, this 6th day obviously has the creation of mammals and the division between mammals and cattle and human beings. And then, of course, very importantly, the way this story, creation story, relates the creation of human beings, called creation story number 1, says, Naaseh Adam B'Tsalmenu. So let us make Adam. Doesn't say what Adam is. It just says Adam, humankind, let's say, B'Tsalmenu, in our image, Kudmutenu, after our likeness. And then it says what Adam will do. And then it says, God created Vayivra, so from the word bara, God created Adam B'Tsalmo. Adam is created in God's image, in the image of God. God created him, or God created them. Zachar v'nekeva, male and female, God created them. So this is a story, funnily enough, that doesn't divide between men and women. It divides between Adam and the creation of other animals. So this is where creation story number 1, the division is not between men and women, but the division is between Adam, that is whatever Adam is, let's call that humankind, and the creation of other animals. And we're given dominance over the other animals, or responsibility over the other animals. And that's an interesting way of thinking about creation story number 1. So it's about the non-gendered experience of humanity. And what's important here then, finally, it says, God blessed them, which is the first thing that God actually blesses, Vayavarech Otam Elohim, Vayomer, and God said to them, Peru Uvaru, be fertile and increase. And that is the first commandment in the Torah, the first time God says to do something. So the first commandment is to reproduce. And that is a commandment to Adam, which is, again, defined as humanity, and therefore non-gendered. Okay, let's get some questions, and we'll then go to the final day. Jesse and Melina.
So I noticed that, and maybe this is just is based on the translation, 'cause I'm not sure, but it seems here that God is not actually telling us we can eat animals, because it seems from the here that we're allowed to eat the plants and the fruits, but it didn't.
The next day, they're
Oh,
gonna show
I
up
don't know.
the
Maybe
next day.
maybe the next day he says we can eat animals, but it doesn't seem like we could eat animals from what it's saying here.
He hasn't showed up.
And just as a side note, I really like this website because you can click on a specific passage and check different translations. And the part that is sea monsters, one of the translations said crocodiles, the other one said whales, another one said the Leviathan, which I thought was interesting. But yeah, this is a side note.
Great. So that I always encourage you to look at different translations, because as we've said earlier, the Hebrew is the original. Everything else is just as one of our famous poets said, that the translation is like kissing through a veil. So it's not the original. It's there's something in front of it. Jill and David, yes.
Yeah, I was curious. Right before God creates humanity, he says, "Let us." Who's us?
Yeah.
Is he more than one? More than one God?
Yeah. So we have this in Hebrew: Naaseh Adam B'Tselmenu. What does that mean? To we will create, let us make. But remember here, the word bara we talked about earlier is the word that when God creates. This is not the word create. This is the word naaseh, to make. So it's slightly changed here, and the rabbis talk about this and say, well, maybe this was the angels, or kind of God's helpers doing this. Why this is here in this first person plural is a conjecture. It's kind of what you will understand, but it's being true to the narrative, in the sense that it's not using the word bara, so it's using another verb. BK.
I think Leslie was before me.
Okay, Leslie.
I was always struck going back in my very limited education, and God saw that this was good. Did he think it might not be, and he'd have to give it another go? I always found that, this is not facetious, I always found that very strange, because it was like, if you draw something or make something and say, now let's start over. Did he have that reaction when he looked at us and he said, well, they could be better, and and that he could have done us another way? Or explain, please.
Yeah, well, as I said, the first three parashas, the first three portions are about that. They're about, I started with Adam, didn't work, so I'm going to then try with Noah, didn't work, I'm going to go to Abraham. So yes, in a way that.
How does that fit with his image of being able? Why doesn't he get it right the first time?
Maybe why don't we get it right the first time?
And I bet God is asking the same question. I couldn't get it right. But each one has a different consequence. So let's say just obviously a different consequence for humanity, but it also has a different consequence for God, because in the first one, God is completely in control. This is my garden, I'm throwing you out. In the second one, God is mainly in control. This is my water, I'll drown you all. But at the end of the story, when Noah comes out of the ark, Noah gets drunk and has incest with his daughters. So God kind of loses control. He thinks Noah is a righteous person, but something went wrong. And then in the third story, Abraham basically says to God, you can't do that. You can't destroy a whole city of people. You're the God of justice. Should the God of justice act not with justice? So from then on, God becomes a limited partner. So in the first two stories, God is kind of almost completely in control. In the third story, God is no longer completely in control. Now it's a covenant, it's a partnership, it's a relationship. It's got to have both parties to make it work. And the history of God, which we will talk about on Wednesday, becomes different. BK, and then let's do the last one.
So I have a theory about why God says that it's good is because God knew Augustine was going to come along and wanted the Christians to understand that were not born bad, but that's a whole other story. Secondly, the we, they, us doesn't have to be plural. It can be non-gendered. And thirdly, I would interpret the possibility that when humanity was created, that it was both genders, that any two humans were able to create. So there's a whole lot in here that can be unpacked and thought about.
Yeah, there's as Dick was saying earlier, like we're reading it now differently because of our understanding of kind of genders as opposed to just two genders, and it makes it all very interesting again with new questions to ask. Right, so the last version, you should know, the last day, it goes like this: Vayachulu hashamayim va'aretz v'kol tzva'am v'yachol Elohim b'yom hashvi malachto asher asa vayishpot b'yom hashvi mikol malachto asher asa. So this is the Friday night Kiddush. These are the words that are recited before the blessing of the wine. And let us choose. Jesse, would you like to read, or Melina, would you like to read this in English?
The heaven and the earth were finished, and all their array. On the seventh day, God finished the work that had been undertaken. God ceased on the seventh day from doing any of the work. And God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, having ceased on it from all the work of creation that God had done. Such is the story of heaven and earth when they were created. When God, Adonai, made earth and heaven. Do you want to continue?
Let's finish there, yes. Yeah, so then we get to the Garden of Eden. So, yes, so that's the beginning of that unit, the end of that unit. Notice that it doesn't actually name that seventh day. It doesn't say what the seventh day is called. We don't have the word Shabbat as a noun, but we do have the word Shabbat as a verb here. Vayishpot b'yom hashvi. God ceased work on the seventh day. And again, we have the verb asa rather than bara. So we're kind of moving away from this, the way in which the author of this thought that God was involved. God is less involved now because we've moved the verb from an exclusive verb for the creation, which only God does, to the word asa, which means to fashion or to form or to make. And that's a word that could also be used by human beings. So when we talk about making Shabbat, you know, people say, oh, I make Shabbat. This is where it comes from. Asa, vayishpot b'yom hashvi. Making Shabbat on the seventh day is a verb rather than a noun. And that, fits into the way we think about Shabbat, is that we make Shabbat holy by the things we do, rather than we have a Shabbat that we have to obey because of the things other people have told us to do. So I think, it's true to say that the concept of making Shabbat into what you think it should be is very much part of the origins of what Shabbat is supposed to be, rather than following laws that tell you what you shouldn't do, and different attitudes to Shabbat there. So we've gone through the first 7 days. Obviously, we've only touched a little bit of the parasha, of the story of the beginning, of the origins of this kind of way in which we see creation and the origins of life, and then how life becomes, and the story of Adam and what Adam does. There is a second creation story. I'm going to encourage you after today to go away and read chapter 2 of Genesis. Are they the same story repeated, just to give you a different perspective? Are they two different authors giving you two ways of thinking about the story? Were there two stories floating around the Middle East that people eventually edited and put together because they couldn't reconcile them? It's in the second story that we read about the rib and Eve, and the idea that there was a woman who came out of a man, and therefore the woman is subservient to the man. That's the second story. the rabbis, as they do, ask all the good questions. Well, if there was this woman, Hava, in Hebrew, or Eve, who comes out of the rib of a man, what happened to the first woman? Because we in Genesis chapter 1, we have a woman who's male and female. So what happened to the first woman? And so the rabbis give her a name, and the name is Lilith. And then she becomes a mythical creature in Jewish folklore. When my daughter went to Rashi, having been in other schools beforehand, she was asked who was the first woman in the Bible, and my daughter said, and everyone else said Eve, and my daughter said, no, it wasn't Eve. There was a woman before Eve called Lilith, and nobody in the class knew who that was, including the teacher. And kind of the note came home: your daughter's being difficult, and is, you know, what's the word? Anyway, the teacher kind of told her off for being difficult in class. But finally, they learned that the rabbis make mention of the first woman, and that becomes a folklore tradition. We unfortunately have come to the end of our time. We can study a lot more of this. I encourage you to read the rest of Bereshit, and then to continue reading as you go forward. And we will gather again in a month, having gone through all of these origin stories to the point where we'll start talking about Abraham and his story. And I look forward to doing that with all of you. And thank you for joining us this morning.
Shabbat shalom, everyone.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom, everybody.